The person in your life who seems the most emotionally whole, the one who never needs to talk through what they're feeling, who listens without needing to be heard, who reads a room faster and more accurately than anyone else in it, almost certainly spent years with no one to talk to. That isn't the damage in their story. That is where the story actually begins. Most people assume that what empaths need, above everything else, is connection. Someone who can receive them. Someone willing to hold what they carry, at least for a moment. The entire cultural conversation about empaths is built on this premise that their sensitivity is a gift requiring tending, that their depth requires relationship to survive, that without the right people around them, they slowly diminish. For most empaths, for most of their lives, that is accurate. But there is a version of the empath that the popular understanding has never been able to explain. The one who stopped looking for the person who would finally understand them. Not because they gave up, not because they became numb or cynical or resolved to simply function without needing anything, but because something happened in the silence, something the sustained presence of a willing listener would have permanently prevented from developing. The question is what that something is, because from the outside, it doesn't look like strength, it looks like withdrawal. It looks like someone who used to be warm and open and available and has, over time, become different, more contained, harder to reach. The people who knew them before say they've changed. What they mean is, you no longer need us the way you used to, and that's accurate, but it is not the full picture. Before we can understand what this person became, we need to understand what they were built on before the silence arrived, because the transformation only makes sense in relation to the original mechanism. And that mechanism is more specific and more demanding than the popular conversation about empaths ever gets precise enough to name. The word empath is used in two different ways that appear similar and are not. The popular version describes someone who feels deeply, who picks up what others miss in a room, who is sensitive to emotional undercurrents that most people move through without registering. This isn't wrong. It's incomplete. It describes the observable output of something with a specific neurological substrate, a documented biological reality that researchers have been studying for decades under a different vocabulary than the one that eventually appeared on social media. The region of the brain that matters here is the insula, a structure folded within the outer cortex that is disproportionately active in people with high sensory processing sensitivity. The insula is the brain's interoceptive center. It continuously monitors the body's internal states, heart rate, breath pattern, muscle tension, the physical texture of an emotional experience as it registers in the body before it surfaces as a thought. In people with a highly responsive insula, the distance between another person's emotional state and their own perception of it narrows significantly. They don't simply understand, in the abstract, that someone near them is in pain or fear or barely managed distress. They register something that functions like a reduced parallel version of that state inside their own nervous system. This is not a metaphor. Research on the neural correlates of empathic response has documented that pain processing regions within the anterior cingulate cortex, the same regions that activate during physical injury, show elevated activation. During witness suffering in individuals with high empathic response, the emotion isn't imagined. It is, in a specific neurological sense, experienced. Consider what this means in ordinary daily life. The empath is running a kind of parallel processing that most people around them are not running. Every room entered, every conversation joined, every relationship maintained, there is a second layer of experience happening beneath the explicit exchange. A continuous stream of emotional data flowing in, registering in the body, requiring some form of engagement before it can pass through. And this stream has to go somewhere. The empath, who is embedded in connection, who has people, who has relationships, who has someone willing to sit with what they're carrying, that stream gets discharged through conversation. It moves outward. It gets processed through exchange, through being heard, through the moment when someone says, "I understand," and something inside the empath briefly settles. The weight, temporarily, lifts. That settlement feels like processing. It isn't, quite. And this distinction is the key to everything that follows. What conversation actually provides is an external container, a social structure that holds the emotional data while the empath moves it through. The internal processing is still happening inside them. The conversation is the vehicle for that processing, not the mechanism itself. Which means the real question, the one the popular model of the empath cannot answer, is what happens when the vehicle is unavailable. When there is no one to call. When the empath has exhausted the people willing to receive them, or simply never had them in sufficient depth, or found that the people around them could only hold so much before their own limits were reached. What happens to the stream when there is no external container to receive it? The assumed answer: collapse, overwhelm, emotional data with nowhere to go and no structure to organize it. And sometimes, at first, that is exactly what happens, but not for long. And not in the direction anyone watching from outside would have predicted. Because the emotional processing does not stop when there is no one to receive it. The stream doesn't quiet because the container is unavailable. The insula doesn't reduce its sensitivity because the social support has disappeared. The capacity for feeling, which is the same capacity for precise perception, does not diminish. What changes is where the processing has to happen. The emotional data that was previously moving outward through conversation begins, under the pressure of necessity, to move in a different direction. Not backward, not into suppression or numbness, inward. And the difference between those two directions is the entire difference between what the empath who had no one became and what the popular model predicted they would become. When processing moves outward through conversation, the empath's experience always includes another person's response as a variable. They speak. The other person reacts. That reaction shapes what comes next. The final form of the processed experience is, in some sense, always a collaboration between the empath's inner world and the other person's capacity and willingness to hold it. That collaboration is comforting. It makes the experience feel real, shared, witnessed, and it introduces a specific kind of noise. The other person's response is never neutral. It is filtered through their own emotional history, their own fears, their own limits of what they can hold without becoming overwhelmed themselves. The empath, who has always processed through conversation, has always processed through that filter. Every conclusion they've reached about their own experience has been shaped at some level by what someone else was able to receive. The empath who has no one has processed without that filter, for the first time, possibly, in their adult life. Research on chronic social isolation documented something that runs directly against what most people would expect. Work by social neuroscientist John Cacioppo established that extended periods without adequate social connection produce heightened perceptual sensitivity, not emotional numbness. The isolated brain becomes more alert, more precise in its reading of what is actually happening, more attuned to signal, to pattern, to the distance between what is presented and what is real. In most people, that heightened alertness from isolation shows up as anxiety, a sharpened threat detection that makes the world feel more dangerous than it is. For the empath, something different operates, because what the empath was sensitized to in the first place wasn't threat. It was signal, the emotional texture beneath the surface, the gap between what people say and what they are actually doing. When isolation forces that sensitivity inward, it doesn't produce fear about the world. It produces something more precise, clarity about the self, about patterns, about the specific distance between what the empath has been telling themselves about their relationships and what has actually been true in them. That process is not comfortable. Let that be stated plainly, without softening. The empath, sitting alone with years of unprocessed experience, without any external container, without anyone to ease the encounter with their own interior that is not a gentle experience, in its early stages, it is a confrontation, often an extended one, the kind that surfaces things the social processing had successfully deferred for years. But a confrontation is not damage. A confrontation is the beginning of accuracy. And accuracy, not sensitivity, not depth, not the capacity for empathy itself. Accuracy is what the empath who had no one eventually develops. The specific capacity to encounter the full, unmediated weight of an experience without distortion, without the filtering of someone else's reception, and to move it through to its actual resolution without requiring anyone else to participate in the process. The prefrontal cortex doesn't simply wait for support that isn't coming. When external support is chronically unavailable, the brain builds internal structure. What researchers who study emotional self-regulation describe as autonomous processing. The capacity to move through the complete arc of an emotional experience: entry, peak intensity, integration, resolution, without requiring external input at any point in the cycle. This is not suppression. That distinction is critical, and the failure to make it is what causes most outside observers to misread what they're seeing in this person. Suppression is temporary. The experience goes underground, it's still unresolved, still waiting for the conversation that never came, still accumulating beneath the surface. Suppression finds its expression eventually in ways that are rarely clean or chosen. Autonomous processing is different in kind, not just degree. The experience moves through to its actual completion. Not the social simulation of completion. That conversation provides the temporary relief of having been heard, which still requires the next conversation to begin again, but the genuine thing, the end of the cycle, the experience resolved internally, without condition. Here is what that produces in the person. They stop explaining themselves. Not from resignation, not because they've decided no one will understand, because the explanation was always part of the processing, and the processing now completes without it. The words they used to need to say out loud to someone else no longer need to be said. The experience is complete before the sentence even forms. They become harder to destabilize. The person who once could be moved by the emotional temperature of a room, who could be shifted by someone's hostility or withdrawal, or the specific quality of disappointment in a look, that person is now less movable. Not because they feel less, because their inner experience is no longer waiting for external confirmation to become real. The feeling is already real. It does not need authentication. They see more clearly. This is the part that seems paradoxical, and it's worth staying with. You might expect that someone processing in isolation, without ongoing social calibration, would become less accurate about others, more locked in their own perception, less attuned to what's actually happening around them. The reverse consistently occurs. Because they are no longer adjusting what they perceive to fit what would be comfortable to say aloud, they perceive without that layer of distortion. The reading of other people becomes more accurate. What changes is not the depth of the perception, it's the announcement. They see what they see. The compulsion to report, all of it is gone. And they stop chasing. Think about what chasing looks like in the empath who still has people to talk to. The persistent effort to be finally understood by this person, this relationship, this specific conversation. The belief that the right words in the right moment will produce the recognition they've been reaching toward. The empath in this mode is always, at some level, waiting. Waiting for the exchange that will make the wait feel shared. Waiting for the person who will finally reflect them back accurately. The empath who has had no one to talk to is no longer doing this. Not because they decided to stop. Because the need that drove the chasing, the need for the experience to be received and confirmed by someone outside, has been met by a different route. Internally. Completely. Without anyone else's participation required. That is the hidden strength. And from outside, it is almost universally misidentified. The people who knew this person before describe them as colder now, harder to reach, guarded in a way that wasn't there before. They say, "You've changed." What they mean, precisely, is, "You used to need us in a way that made us feel essential, and now you don't. And we don't know how to position ourselves in relation to someone who doesn't need that anymore." They are right that something has changed. What they've misread is whether the change is a loss. What happens when this person moves back into the world of close relationship? What do the people around them encounter now that they didn't encounter before? The first thing that becomes apparent: they are no longer easy to guilt. The empath embedded in external validation is vulnerable to a specific dynamic. If you can convince them that their own perception is the distortion, that their sensitivity is the problem, that what they felt wasn't what actually happened, you redirect their empathy away from their own experience and toward yours. The person who performs their pain at the greatest volume often wins, because the empath feels that pain and attributes it to their own failure to accommodate. The empath who processed alone has sat with that dynamic without a witness to confirm or complicate their reading of it. They had to evaluate what they were actually feeling against what they were being told they should feel repeatedly, without anyone else's version competing for authority in the room. And in that evaluation done alone, without the option of outsourcing the conclusion, they developed something specific. Precision about the difference between what they feel and what they are being told they should feel. This form of leverage no longer finds the entry point it needs, not because they hardened, because they became accurate. The second thing people notice is more unsettling to encounter. The empath who processed alone still sees everything, still tracks the emotional undercurrent running beneath the social surface, still registers what isn't being said, what is being performed, what is being carefully avoided. The sensitivity didn't diminish. What changed is the response. They see that someone is using pain as a tool for extraction. They don't produce the performance the situation is designed to reward. They see that someone is performing warmth to avoid a difficult conversation. They don't step in to ease the avoidance along. They see the gap between what someone is saying and what they actually want. They don't automatically fill it with effort. To people accustomed to an empath whose sensitivity was freely available as a resource, people who benefited, consciously or otherwise, from the way the empath's capacity to feel could be reliably engaged, this shift is disorienting. They describe it as coldness, as the empath having become withholding or difficult. What they're describing accurately, though they've misnamed it, is this person is no longer providing access to something I used to be able to take without asking. That is not coldness. That is the specific development that makes everything that follows possible. Researchers who examine post-traumatic growth, the framework developed by psychologists Tedeschi and Calhoun, based on documented patterns in people who move through significant adversity and emerge structurally changed rather than simply recovered, identified, consistent developments among those individuals. Greater clarity about personal values, a stronger sense of individual capability, a more deliberate relationship to connection with others, and a fundamentally altered relationship to the experience of being alone with oneself, one in which the aloneness is no longer threatening. It is familiar, and familiarity with aloneness is a form of freedom that people who have only ever had the external container provided cannot easily understand from inside their own lives. The empath who spent years with no one to talk to isn't necessarily a trauma case, but the arc of transformation follows a structurally parallel pattern. The reorganization of internal resources because external resources were unavailable produced a capability that wasn't there before, not compensation for what was lost. Something built from the absence itself, something that the loss and only the loss made possible. The external resource that wasn't there, someone to receive me. The internal capability that developed in its place, the capacity to receive myself. Most people move through their entire lives without developing this, not from weakness, but because the external support was there. The container was provided. The need to build one internally never arose with any urgency. The empath who had no one built it by necessity. And what necessity builds tends to be more durable than what preference constructs. The consequence for every relationship that follows is specific. When this empath enters a relationship now, they are not there because they need to be, not because the other person is meeting a fundamental requirement that their emotional processing depends on to function. They are there from a position of sufficiency, a baseline that does not require the relationship to sustain itself. That changes the architecture of connection at its foundation. Most dynamics between empaths and the people drawn to them rest, often without anyone naming it, on the empath's underlying need. The empath needs to be understood. The other person partially provides that. The empath stays. The dynamic becomes complicated in ways that trace directly back to that original need as the organizing principle of everything that follows. The empath who no longer needs to be understood doesn't enter that dynamic. What they bring into relationship is something different in kind, presence without dependency, attention without the condition of reciprocation, care that doesn't require being received in order to remain genuine. For the person capable of meeting that, and not everyone is, it is a fundamentally different quality of connection than anything that came before it. Not better in the way that is easier, better in the way that is more real. There is something that happens when this is described to the empath who lived it. When they finally hear the accurate account of what the silence actually produced, it isn't relief, exactly. It's recognition, the precise quality of recognition that comes from hearing something you already understood in your body, articulated clearly in words for the first time. Because the empath who came through the years of no one has known, at some level, that they are not who they were before the silence. They've felt the difference. They've tried to understand whether what they became is better or worse than what they were, whether the strength they feel is genuine or is armor they've been calling something else, whether the fact that they no longer need people the way they used to represents development or damage. The mechanism gives the answer. The need to be received was real. It wasn't neurotic. It wasn't excessive. It was the natural expression of a nervous system carrying more emotional data than the standard allocation and needing somewhere for it to go. That need was legitimate. What changed is not its legitimacy. What changed is what the empath can do with the full weight of their experience when that need isn't met. They stopped requiring the experience to be witnessed in order for it to be real. That is a specific structural change in how emotional information functions inside this person. The experience is real, whether or not anyone receives it. The emotion has completed its cycle whether or not anyone was present while it did. They are whole in this moment completely, genuinely whole without external confirmation of any kind. That is not a shift in coping strategy. That is a fundamental reorganization of the relationship between the self and the need for validation from outside. It cannot be taught. It cannot be given. It cannot be acquired as a technique or understood as an abstraction. It can only be produced under specific conditions, and the empath who had no one knows those conditions from the inside. The silence that looked like abandonment was actually the condition. The absence that felt like loss was the forge. The years of no one to call, no one to process with, no one to finally understand what they were carrying those years did not hollow them out. They filled them in, not with comfort or ease, with something more durable. The tested embodied knowledge that they can feel everything completely, hold the full weight of their own experience, and arrive at their own resolution, without needing anyone present when it happens. And once someone carries that knowledge not as a belief, not as something accepted intellectually, but as something they know because they lived through the specific conditions that proved it, there is nothing that another person's absence can take from them that they haven't already demonstrated they can reclaim. What the silence built in them, nothing else could have given. If you recognize that not as an idea but as a description of something you actually lived, you already know what the years of no one produced. You already know what grew in you during that time that nothing else could have grown. The question isn't whether you survived it. You know you did. The question is whether you understand yet what you are now carrying because of it. Most people who watch this will recognize someone else in it first. A smaller number will recognize themselves. If you're in the second group reading your own experience in what was just described, the next video is worth finding before you decide what the silence cost you. Because what the empath who had no one does with everything that follows, the relationships, the choices, the specific way this kind of strength operates in the world, when it finally has somewhere to go that goes somewhere. Most conversations about empaths never arrive, and it changes the question you're asking about yourself.